So, today we're going to be looking at some of the ways someone might try to defend the existence of free will from this challenge coming from Libet's neuroscience experiment. So, in this argument, we're going to begin by reviewing the Libet argument against free will. And then we'll see how someone might try to defend free will by raising problems for each premise in this argument. Regarding the empirical premise, we'll consider the question, is the beginning of the readiness potential really a decision? Regarding the empirical generalization, we'll consider, is this a hasty generalization? Regarding the philosophical premise, we're going to take a closer look at the relationship between conscious thinking and free will. So there's going to be problems that arise for every premise in this argument, thereby giving us reason to doubt that the argument really does establish its conclusion. So let's review the argument. It starts out by saying subjects in Libet's experiments do not consciously decide to flex their wrist. Premise 2 says, so people probably never make conscious decision to do things. Well, free will requires that our actions are caused by our conscious decisions to do things. Thus, people probably do not have free will. So let's consider that first premise again. Subjects in these experiments do not consciously decide to flex their wrist. Well, remember, the argument against free will here depends on Libet's and others' assumption or interpretation that the beginning of the readiness potential represents a decision to flex being made in the brain. So remember, the readiness potential, as it's defined, just is that rise in electrical activity before, say, voluntary movement. But according to Libet, that electrical activity, that readiness potential, represents a decision being made. A problem here, though, is that it's possible that that unconscious brain activity is something other than a decision. And if it's something other than a decision, then the experiment doesn't prove that a decision is being made unconsciously. So Libet's experiment is set up to record brain activity whenever a flex occurs. Whenever there's a flex, there's a readiness potential beforehand. So that might make it look like a decision to flex is being made. But notice, the experiment did not look for whether there was always a flex after a readiness potential. It didn't check to see whether you ever have a readiness potential without a flex afterward. So, basically, the machine is set up so that when someone flexes their wrist, it records the brain activity beforehand and afterwards in the sort of log. But it doesn't look to try to record sort of brain activity that looks like the readiness potential to check to see whether or not a flex happens before. So it's possible that this readiness potential, that brain activity, happened a whole bunch, but never turned into a flex. The experiment just didn't look for that. So maybe the beginning of the readiness potential represents something besides a decision. Maybe it's just a person imagining flexing their wrist. Maybe it's a person thinking about flexing their wrist soon, where they might decide to and they might decide not to. Maybe it's a person preparing to do something even if they don't intend to do it, or even if they haven't decided to do it yet. So the idea is maybe that brain activity is the brain sort of getting ready to make a decision without having made one already. So maybe the brain activity occurs and later they might make a decision to flex their wrist, and they might later choose not to flex their wrist. We don't know. So another experiment by Libet actually seems to suggest that the readiness potential does not represent an intention or decision being made. So remember, these are the results that we saw from Libet's experiment. At about 550 milliseconds before they move their wrist, you see the EEG measure the increase in electrical activity. That's the beginning of the readiness potential. And then about 220 milliseconds beforehand, you see the sort of conscious thought or urge to sort of flex the wrist. They become aware of a decision. And then a little bit later, the sort of wrist flexes. So notice the controversy arises over this first part, this electrical activity, that beginning of the readiness potential. What does that electrical activity in the brain represent? According to Libet and others who are skeptical of free will, they think that it's the brain making a decision to flex the wrist. So they think the decision happens first unconsciously, and then where that sort of thought bubble is a little later, that's where someone becomes aware or conscious of that decision, and then the wrist flexes. What Mealy is pointing out is that it's possible that that brain activity is something else, like the brain preparing to make a decision, or the brain thinking about an action, or imagining an action without actually making a decision. Now notice, so Libet believed that once we become aware of our decision or intentions to do something right away, we have about a tenth of a second to sort of veto them. And so he thought free will might play a role in vetoing. As someone put it, Libet believed that although we don't have free will, we do have free won't. So the idea here is even if our unconscious mind sort of makes our decisions and then sort of starts or generates our actions, once we become aware of those decisions, we have a sort of split second to sort of resist what the unconscious brain is telling us to do. I mean, this actually sounds rather familiar. If you've ever sort of felt an urge to do something and then resisted that urge, the idea is it looks like your brain is sort of telling you, do this, and you're thinking, and once you become aware of that urge, you're like, oh no, is the idea. So to see this in this picture, so here's this idea of, according to Libet, he thinks a decision's made at the readiness potential, then we become aware of it in that little thought bubble, and then we sort of do the action, flexing the wrist. But notice there's a little gap between the thought bubble and the wrist flexing. This is where he says there's an opening, there's a gap. So once we become conscious of that sort of decision that's already been made, he said it's possible that our conscious awareness will allow us to veto the decision that the brain made unconsciously earlier. All right, so how could we get evidence that maybe this is the case? Well, Libet thought that he could. And so he ran an experiment to test this hypothesis that we might be able to veto these sort of unconscious decisions. So in this experiment, he told participants to prepare to flex at a certain time. For example, when the spot hit the 9 o'clock point on that fast clock that we looked at last time, but not to follow through, not to actually flex. To get evidence about what goes on in the brain during this process, he took EEG readings. So think about this sort of carefully. They're saying, watch this dot go around the clock, and I want you to prepare to flex your wrist when the dot sort of hits the 9. But when it hits the 9, I want you to prepare to flex your wrist at that time, but when it hits the dot, I want you to not flex your wrist. All right, and you had the EEG recording the sort of brain activity during this time. So what did he find? He discovered that a rise of electrical activity in the brain began about a second before the designated time and then petered out about 150 to 250 milliseconds before that time. Until it petered out, the EEG readings looked a lot like the readings he found when people flexed at a time the experimenter selected in advance for them. All right, so he saw that rise in electrical activity before the movement, but then about 150 to 250 milliseconds before sort of the time they were supposed to prepare to flex their wrist, they saw that electrical activity sort of petered out and went down. So Libet's interpretation of this is that in this veto experiment, subjects intended to flex their wrist when the dot reached the 9, but then they vetoed that intention. They sort of resisted the sort of unconscious decision that their brain made. Now, what Mealy points out is that it seems like Libet's interpretation of his own experiment is bad. Preparing to flex your wrist at a certain time is not the same thing as intending or deciding to flex your wrist at that time. If the subjects were instructed not to flex their wrist, if someone says, do not flex your wrist when that dot hits the 9, then it seems like they don't have any intention to flex their wrist at that time. So, in fact, they intend not to flex their wrist. So Mealy gives a snapping example. Now I can't snap, so I'm going to use clapping. So I'm going to ask you, I want you to prepare to clap on the count of 3, but don't actually clap when I say 3. So 1, 2, 3. All right, good. Hopefully you didn't clap. But did you prepare to clap? Now, did you just sit there sort of doing sort of nothing? No. I want you to do this again. I want you to actually prepare to clap on 3. But then once you actually get to 3, don't do it. All right, so 1, 2, 3. Now, what you might have done is you might have maybe, as I was sort of counting up, 1, 2, maybe you sort of raised your sort of hands up, maybe even sort of brought your sort of hands apart and sort of started to bring them together, but then just stopped yourself from clapping them together. Now, the point of this example is, at any point in that time, did you ever intend to actually clap your hands on 3? Did you ever make a decision to clap your hands on 3? Mealy says, no, of course not. I told you not to clap. And so you didn't intend to clap on 3. In fact, you intended not to clap. And so the idea is similarly, when Libet tells his subjects to plan to flex their wrist when the clock reaches a certain point, but then don't flex your wrist, it looks like they didn't have any intention to flex their wrist. And so there's no intention for them to veto. And so this gives evidence, since we saw electrical activity that looks like the readiness potential, even though in this example it looks like the subjects never intended to flex their wrist, well then, if you see the electrical activity without any intention to flex, then the electrical activity represents something other than a decision or intention to perform this behavior. And so that suggests that there is not a decision, an unconscious decision being made when you see that electrical activity. It's something else. Maybe it's the brain preparing to make a decision without actually making one. Just like you prepared your hands to clap without actually intending to clap. All right, so this brings us then to premise 2. So let's just assume that people do make unconscious decisions. We've seen the problems with that, so you might reject it. But let's say you accept it. Well, then Libet tries to say, well, so people probably never make conscious decisions to do things. The problem here is that this seems like a hasty generalization. Even if he's right about how people make decisions in his experiment, it's not clear that we could say that that's how people always make their decisions. A subject's decision to flex their wrist is an arbitrary decision. The point here is just that they have no reason to flex their wrist at one time rather than another. There's no pros or cons to weigh. So subjects are specifically instructed to flex spontaneously without conscious thinking about or planning when to flex. And so it just doesn't matter to them whether they flex after 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 25 seconds or 45 seconds. It just doesn't make a difference. And so they have nothing to reason about when making this decision. It's completely arbitrary. So Mealy says it's analogous to, imagine I go to the grocery store and I need to get some macaroni and cheese for my kids. Well, I go to the grocery store and I see 20 identical boxes of macaroni and cheese on the grocery store. Well, in that case, I just pick one. I have no reason to pick the one on the left or the one on the right or the one in the middle or the one that's second to the left because they're all identical. It's just an arbitrary, random decision. And so someone might say, look, it doesn't look like I exercise my free will when I decide to grab one of those random boxes off there. And so why should I think that those random decisions are representative of where I would usually think free will is involved? So even if decisions are made unconsciously in these arbitrary situations, why should we think that those situations are representative of all our decisions? In many other situations, we're not making arbitrary decisions. We're making important decisions where there's pros and cons for us to weigh. So, in the experiment, it looks like there's just no purpose to reasoning, to conscious reasoning. But when you're making an important decision, say about where to go to school, when you chose to go to Tuskegee for school, there were pros and cons about maybe where the location was, whether they had your major, what the tuition was, how much scholarship money you were giving. You had to weigh those pros and cons. And so there's a lot for your conscious thinking to do. It's not just an arbitrary decision. Why should I think that the way the brain works in making decisions in the arbitrariness of flexing your wrist spontaneously when I tell you just don't think about it, why should I think that the way you make that decision is the same way you make an important decision like where to go to school? Now, if we want to know whether conscious reasoning ever plays a role in producing decisions, we shouldn't restrict our attention to situations in which people are instructed not to think about what to do, when they're instructed to make a spontaneous, arbitrary decision. The idea is, obviously, there's not going to be any conscious reasoning there because you told them not to think about it. All right, so this brings us to premise 3 that says, look, free will requires that our actions result from a conscious decision. But there's a problem with this as well. Even if the decision is unconscious at the time we make it, that doesn't mean our conscious reasoning plays no role in producing our decisions. So imagine I weigh pros and cons for a certain decision I'm thinking about making. So my reasoning may cause me to make an unconscious decision that I become conscious of a few milliseconds later. So sometimes, for instance, I deliberate and consciously weigh the pros and cons of a decision. But every once in a while I get a little bit sort of tired of sort of thinking it through. I can't sort of make a decision right then. And so I take a break from thinking about it. So trying to clear my mind. And sometimes I find that without realizing it, I made my decision while I was thinking about something else. So like when I go back to it, I'm like, oh yeah, I've already made my decision. That's what I'm going to do. Now, if my previous weighing of pros and cons really helped me make my decision, does it really matter whether I'm conscious of the decision at the exact moment I make it or only about a third of a second later? If that earlier conscious sort of weighing of pros and cons still caused my unconscious decision, then it looks like my conscious reasoning still plays a very important role in explaining why I made the decision that I did. And isn't that enough for that decision to be sort of freely made? So here's a picture of what I have in mind there and what I think Mealy suggests at certain points, although he doesn't really sort of spell it out in detail. The idea is there's an earlier time on the left here where in my own sort of thought bubble, I'm weighing the pros and cons sort of in my own mind. And then maybe I sleep on it or I go bowling just to get my mind off it. The idea is that those conscious thoughts, there's an error. They lead me to maybe while I'm bowling, thinking about other things, unconsciously deciding to go to Tuskegee. And then because when I make that unconscious decision, that then causes me to become conscious of the decision, sort of have the thought, oh, I'll go to Tuskegee about a third of a second after it's made. The idea is, notice, even though the decision is made unconsciously, there's still all that earlier conscious reasoning of pros and cons that plays a very important role in explaining the decision and choice that I made. And wouldn't that be good enough to say that the decision was in my control? All right, so let's just sort of rehash. Here's the Libet argument against free will. His first premise says, subjects in this experiment do not consciously decide to flex their wrist. As we've seen, there's reason to doubt this premise, since there's reason to doubt whether or not the beginning of the readiness potential really is a decision being made in the brain rather than something else. Well, then he goes on to say, so people probably never make conscious decisions to do anything. Well, yet again, this seems like a hasty generalization. So jumping from 1 to 2 seems like a hasty generalization because a lot of the decisions we make are not similar to the arbitrary decisions we're making in the experiments. And then premise 3, free will requires that our actions are caused by our conscious decisions to do things. We've noticed there's other ways for our conscious reasoning to play a role in our decisions other than us being conscious of the decision at the very time we make it, since our earlier conscious weighing of pros and cons might enter into the explanation for why we made those choices. All right, and then the sort of conclusion. So the idea is, if we have reason to doubt each and every one of these premises, it looks like we have reason to doubt that Libet's experiment really can establish this conclusion. And so this doesn't prove that we do have free will, but the idea is it gives us reason to doubt that this argument shows that we don't have free will. So that's it for discussing Libet's experiment. Don't forget to look at optional videos, post the discussion boards, etc. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.